Let's get started. If you please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Cookie, if you would do the roll call, please.
Jackie Nunez.
Present.
Susan Rowinski. Present. Clifford Robbins.
Here.
Rafael Reyes. Present. And Greg St. Clair.
Excellent. First item is ceremonial. Well, it has a little more weight than that. We need to elect a new chair and vice chair. As the current chair, I will entertain motions. Do I hear a motion?
I motion for Raphael as chair and Susan as vice chair.
Okay, I think we should do them separately just because that's what we need to do.
You got it.
Unlikely to be controversy, but in case there is, gives people a chance. So I hear a motion for Raphael to be chair. Do I hear a second?
I second that motion.
I hear a second. All in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. None opposed. My condolences. You get the chair. And I guess I will pass the gavel to you right now, though I guess I'll first do the vice chair. Or do you want me to wait till the end of the meeting? That'd be glad. Okay, let's do vice chair. I hear a motion for Susan Rowinski to be vice chair. Do I hear a second?
I second that motion.
I hear it seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? None. Congratulations as well. You were there. All right. Let's swap seats. Okay. All right. Well, no, but wait a second. There you go. And I'm giving you the gavel, and I'm going to just kick back. All right. Let's see. There you go. You know me. I'll be silent, and I'm not.
If I'm taking a little time to get my agenda up here, but would you be so kind of sharing the agenda that you have in front of you? That would be wonderful. Thank you. Well, thank you all for the honor to serve as chair, and thank you, Cliff, for having done so diligently and effectively for this past year. So with that, we should move on to the consent calendar and approval of the minutes. Do I have a motion?
I would just like to raise an item as it relates to the minutes. And that is during the June meeting, I had brought to the Commission's attention a very important cost-effectiveness study that is going to be released roughly around mid-August. And that is it has to do with the electrification, the cost-effectiveness or the absence thereof of multifamily units greater than 4 stories, and my understanding it also includes hotels as well. And the reason I had brought that up is that is by far the most common construction type taking place in our city, and particularly since we're now talking about REACH codes, I thought it would be worthwhile for the SIC to hear the outcome, however it falls out, cost effective or not, or under what conditions. And if that study is released mid-August, possibly listening to it during the September meeting. I think in September is also when we're due to get an update on the cap as well. Though this is separate from the cap, they do have some sort of commonality. So I would like to propose, is that the word, Brad? Yeah, propose that this be added to the September meeting and the commissioners take a vote?
Yeah, but I think this should be taken up probably at the end of the meeting in reports and announcements rather than at the point in time at the consent calendar.
Yeah, since Raphael, you did not get the privilege of being at the last meeting, if you don't mind, I'll step in. I think right now we just should address the minutes. If it's something that should be in the minutes or edit the minutes, That should be the comment, and then we should approve them or not. And then I concur. If you want to have something added to the agenda, we should discuss it at the very end of the meeting, and then we vote to
Got it.
to ask staff to put it
All
up
right.
or not.
All right.
Okay.
Okay, so do I have a motion on the minutes?
I'll move approval.
I'll second.
Okay, any comments, corrections, or updates to the minutes? All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Okay, I'm abstaining because I was not at that meeting. Thank you. Moving on to public comment on any item not on the agenda. Do we have any public comment on any item not on the agenda?
No, I don't.
Okay. Then with that, we will move on to new business, letters of support for Transportation Development Act, Article 3.
Good evening. Thanks for having me. I'm Sue Ellen Atkinson, Parking Manager in the Public Works Department, here on a request for a letter of support for the Transportation Development Act, or TDA, Article 3 grant application, the funding for project cycle that's out for fiscal year 1920. Under this call for projects for the current fiscal year, the maximum planning grant amount that a jurisdiction can request is $100,000. That's a 50% match required. This program is administered by the City and County Association of Governments, or CCAG. In this application, support from the city's Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Committee, which the commission functions as, is required. So we're here tonight to request a letter of support for our proposed project under this year's call for projects. And the project that we are proposing is the Transit-Oriented Development Pedestrian Access Study, in which we will be seeking to improve the safety, comfort, and accessibility of the walking environment to the city's 3 Caltrain stations. Through that, we hope to increase the walking mode share to Caltrain. In future years, Caltrain is looking to increase service at all stations in San Mateo, and making the stations more accessible for pedestrians is really of utmost importance to ensure that we can have access to the stations. So through this study, we would be looking at the half-mile radius around each of the 3 Caltrain stations in the city and assessing any improvements that are necessary. So that ranges from sidewalk width, crosswalks that are necessary, lead pedestrian interval if that's appropriate, pedestrian scale lighting to increase comfort and security, countdown signals if there are none. So identifying and prioritizing projects that would improve the pedestrian realm in that half-mile radius where it's assumed that people can walk to transit, so that we can increase the availability of walking as a transportation mode to transit. And that identification and prioritization would allow us to fund and then implement those projects either through local funding, grant funding, or developer funding. So the recommendation for this item is that the Sustainability and Infrastructure Commission, acting as the City of San Mateo's Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Committee, approve the letter of support that was included in the agenda packet to the San Mateo City and County Association of Governments, and authorize the chair to sign the letter on behalf of the commission. So a very short presentation available for questions if you have them, and we do have that letter available tonight if you do approve that.
Okay, why don't we move to questions for staff on this item? Shall we, Jackie, would you like to start?
Just one question about the match funding. Does that come from CCAG or the city?
The city would have to provide the 50% match.
Okay.
That's a requirement in the application.
Okay, and that's allocated for in the next fiscal year?
The department management has indicated that we can find that 50% match.
Okay, thanks, that's all.
To help with the cities, I know we're talking about a letter from our commission, but is there any reason why residents could not also submit a letter of support?
That would absolutely be welcome. We took this item to the City Council's Legislative Committee last night and have a similar letter on the consent calendar for the 15th for council support. We've also requested and will be receiving a letter of support from the county health system, but any residents who are interested and supportive of the project can certainly send a letter of support to me directly.
Sure, and so they would send it to you. Do they? And who would they address it to, and by when?
The applications are due on July 25th, so we will be compiling that application at the end of next week, and it would be addressed to CCAG, care of John Huang, and his contact information is in the draft letter
Right,
that's in the packet.
And then send that off to you, and then put it in our packet.
Correct, and email is totally fine.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
No questions. Nice letter.
Greg?
No question. Just anytime we can get money and it can help us do something in bettering the city, I'm 100% for it.
Okay. No further comments from me. Any comments from the public?
No, I have nothing.
Okay, then. Then why don't we move to any motion on this? Do I have a motion to approve?
I'll move approval of the letter.
Second?
All right, all those in favor?
Aye.
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 All right.
Mr. Chair, I can drop off the letter with you and you can give it back to Cookie or to Brad before the end of the evening.
No problem, thank you. All right, easy enough. Moving on to item 4, the proposed AT&T master license agreement.
Hold on one moment, I'll bring this up. So good evening and welcome. My name is Tracy Scrimalia. I'm Senior Engineer in Public Works. It's been a while since I've been before you. I think the last time I was here was for a very similar item we were looking at for a master license agreement with Verizon. So this will look very familiar to you because it's essentially the same. The agenda is pretty simple. We're going to go over why we want to use the master license agreement, kind of a timeline, the main master license agreement provisions in there, as well as staff recommendations and next step. And then here tonight, we have Cliff, Cliff F. Here to do a short presentation. He's with AT&T. So why use a master license agreement? It reduces the need for companies to install their own poles. Oftentimes, if there's not a utility pole in the right location, they would need to put in their own poles. And this would highly decrease that possibility. Also, the ability to locate small cells to better locations, which would be streetlights versus utility poles. Right now, they do not have authorization to use our streetlights. They have to have a master license agreement in order to use our streetlights. And this just gives another option for the telecoms to use different sites and maybe less obtrusive sites versus utility poles. The main provisions, 10 years, and then there's ability to renew for 15 one-year renewals. The payment is $270 annually, and this is set by the FCC. You might think this is kind of low. We agree, but this is legally the maximum amount we can currently charge. RF emission testing, it ensures that it complies with the FCC standards. However, we do have a wireless permit that also requires this as well. And then the most important part of the master license agreement is that it doesn't mean that they can just go ahead and put them in. They still have to go through our telecom permit procedures that's outlined in our municipal code right now. The majority of our applications so far have been on PG&E poles because, as I mentioned before, the telecoms already have the authorization to use them. Staff's recommending license agreements to permit the use of streetlights because they are visually less obtrusive and they can be located anywhere in street medians or the edge of parks, and it's not limited to where there may or may not be a utility pole. And the streetlight installations may require, just a note, that they may require additional sites because these poles are shorter than a utility pole, and the way the operations work, they may need more because they can't travel as far because they're on a shorter, the poles are shorter. And Cliff can probably go into some of that detail later. So staff has prepared this draft master license agreement, which was based on what we approved with Verizon. Verizon did go to city council. The master license for Verizon went to city council and was approved. So we started with that agreement. If the agreement is supported tonight, we will go to city council for the final approval. And if there's any proposed installations, they still, as I mentioned, are still required to follow our city ordinance and to get a telecom permit. The license agreement is solely to authorize the use. It doesn't allow them necessarily to have a specific site. And as you notice in the license agreement, no specific sites are indicated because nothing's been approved yet. It's just the ability that they have to use a streetlight as opposed to a utility pole. So staff recommends that the Sustainability and Infrastructure Commission recommend approval of this master license agreement to City Council. The next steps would be that we would go to City Council. AT&T will apply for telecom permits and still meet all the requirements for any streetlights that they want to install on. And these telecom permits are approved or denied by a Director of Public Works. And any appeals, again, are reviewed by the S&I Commission. So with that finishes my presentation, and I'd like to invite Cliff up to do a short presentation on behalf of AT&T.
Well, thank you, Tracy. My name is Cliff Fitterer. I'm a consultant at AT&T. I'm a senior vice president at the Wireless Policy Group. I've been in the wireless industry for the past 28 years, designing and building wireless networks. And on behalf of AT&T, I just want to thank the commission and the city for hosting us tonight to talk about this. And I will say, just looking at the city's website, there's a website that the city's put together, the small cell infrastructure webpage. There's been a lot of prep work done and prepared for this next generation infrastructure. So all I wanted to do this evening was to give you a brief overview of small cell technology. I want to show you what it looks like, what installations AT&T currently has in the area, and talk about how it fits into the bigger picture about wireless networks. So if you could go to my next slide, one of the key drivers for this, if you've followed what's been going on with all the data applications, unbelievable demand uptick for both consumers and business users. And 450,000% increase in data traffic over the last 7 or 10 years. And if our roads had that much vehicular traffic increase, which as we all live in the Bay Area, we know we've got significant traffic issues on roadways. And I'm bringing that up just simply because there's an analogy between traffic engineering, a transportation corridor, and a wireless network. And there's different ways to fuel capacity in a wireless network, but the finite resource that all wireless carriers has is the airwaves, which is regulated by the FCC, licenses are auctioned off, and there isn't an infinite amount of spectrum. So the technology that AT&T would like to invest in to start with, if this agreement is approved and we go through the full permitting process that you outlined, would first be on the 4G network, and it would use the existing spectrum that exists today with AT&T's macro sites. And macro sites are the traditional sites. You've seen them on rooftops. There's freestanding towers. And they're really umbrella coverage layer over, let's say, a large urban area like this. Small cells are really aimed and very targeted solutions to add more capacity in areas where there's super high usage density. So in the case of your city, if you look at El Camino and different roads where you might even have a parade or lots of traffic, carriers are looking at those locations and they have demand forecasts and they target those locations. So the purpose of a small cell is really to augment the capacity of the network and increase and improve the user experience. So you all have different experiences with data speeds depending on what carrier you use. This is all aimed at improving data speeds, adding more capacity to the network, and improving quality of it. So if you go to the next slide. So I have pictures of real-world installations. This is really a cartoon picture to show you what it is. They are small cells, and ideally the city structures that are in the public right-of-way are the ideal target structures. And Tracy mentioned the height, and a lot of these streetlights are 30, 35 feet high. And small cells transmit at a far lower power than a large macro cell. And she mentioned they have a different coverage radius than, let's say, a macro cell. Out in rural areas, you could have very tall sites that might have a 10-mile coverage area. Some of the sites that are in the Bay Area and in San Mateo might only have a serving radius of a half mile to maybe 2 or 3 miles. Well, small cells will have a radius of about 500 to 1,200 feet. And so there's simply only 4 visible components that are going to be on a small cell. There's typically a cylindrical antenna, some radio enclosures that are attached to the pole, and then there's a power disconnect switch on a pole. And so in terms of network assets, this is a complementary technology to the existing macro cell sites that you have and have permitted use in your city. These small cells, if you originate a data session or a transaction inside of a small cell coverage area, you move out of that, it has to have super fast coordination with the big cell network. So all the cells talk to each other. These complement the macrocellular network. So if we could go to the next slide. I think we covered some of this. She covered the highlights of the agreement right now. We're still working just to finalize that with Tracy and the city attorney's office. And as she mentioned, approving an agreement isn't approving a permit. AT&T will go through and want to continue to partner with the city on filling out an application, getting the wireless permit processed, and following that right through all of your standards and your municipal code. One of the benefits, I mentioned the height structure of small cells being the ideal height. There are also proximity utilities, including other broadband connections, and even more importantly, power. So we certainly have appreciated the collaboration with the Public Works team in discussing this agreement. I guess the last things I just wanted to show you were some pictures of some installations that we have around the Bay Area today. I'm currently working with 26 different cities around the Bay. I'm a native of the Bay Area, born in Palo Alto, live in Walnut Creek, but I'm working with commissions and city councils like yourselves all around the Bay Area right now. If you can go to the next slide. These are some examples in different locations. There is a wood pole in the lower left corner, application right there, and what I will say about the wood poles is you end up seeing more equipment because you can't hide the cabling that connects the equipment on the pole inside the interior of a pole, where you can do that with a streetlight. If you can go to the next slide, we have some pictures of the network that's being built down in San Jose right now. These are installed on-air small cells in San Jose. And these would be pretty similar aesthetically in the look that we would propose to the city when we get to the permit stage. There's a couple more examples. Downtown San Francisco was one of the first areas that AT&T built small cells in the Bay Area, and so these are examples of ones that are on the air there. And then finally, these are just photo simulations of, I have 2 potential locations just to show you here in San Mateo. using your streetlights. We're adding about 3.5 cubic feet of equipment to a pole. And that equipment, those radios and that switch are somewhere between 10 and 14 feet above ground level. So when you see those boxes attached to the pole, there's no exposed wiring showing or anything like that. Coaxial cable, it's all, their cables come out of those radios and they go on the interior of the pole. So this is an example of attaching this next generation wireless infrastructure to your city poles. So we really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you this evening, and if need arises, I'd be happy to answer any questions, and we would appreciate your adoption of the staff recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So with that, we'll move to questions from commissioners.
One of the questions always is, everything is new and improved today, and then it becomes obsolete in 3 or 5 years. PG&E in the city, PG&E in poles, where if you're up in the city, you'll see there's poles with 100 wires coming off them, and they look horrible. So where you just are looking like you're putting a decorative little top on, or a little box on the side, it's probably not going to be recognizable or a problem, as long as it fits in and doesn't have issues with multiple, and they just keep growing. That's the biggest fear that I have. And that's always, I have a question for you, if you don't mind, Cliff. What is the maximum issue that AT&T is looking for in this position? Because again, all the different phone companies, all the different cell sites, all want to be part of this. Is it too much? Because what is the maximum overlay where citizens are saying, if you have a 1,200 foot coverage, how far do you have to overlap each? You don't have to overlap them so they're each 200 feet, so you have maximum. What is your overlap?
You actually don't need the overlap because, as I mentioned, the small cell will hand off to the big cell coverage area, right? So you don't have to all be lined up in a string down a street. Is that your question in terms of what the position is? Because there's super fast inter-cell coordination between a small cell and the big cell. So if you only had one cell and it just happened to be an area where there's a venue outside, there's a lot of traffic congestion, people are on their phones, and there's static traffic, you may have a small cell in that location. And AT&T has a network engineering team that's looking at those statistics. They're looking at what that usage density is. They map it out. They say, wow, that's a hot spot here. We need a cell. Now, it doesn't imply that they need to have a whole string of those things connected. It depends on how the demand migrates over time.
So basically, you're going to be monitoring to see where the hot spots are and put the maximum coverage there versus just saying we're going to blanket everything.
That's right. This is all driven initially by capacity hotspots. I mean, you could have 5 bars of a signal there. You know, you look at your phone and say, why do I need a small cell here? Well, what you're not seeing by that is really what the throughput is and what that's doing to exhaust the serving spectrum that's coming from, you know, the main serving site. So that's why densification of the network's there. I can't predict, 10 years from now how many they're going to be, but we know that consumers and businesses want faster speeds. They want it when they want it, and they want a very low latency connection. So this is the next generation infrastructure asset that will enable that, along with other changes that will be occurring to the network. So these are all connected to the big network. I hope that answered your question.
You do. Now, another question. You're dealing with a lot of different cities.
Yes.
You've been with AT&T a long time. What is the biggest headache that people are saying, or city staff is saying to you, is the biggest concerns for other cities?
Well, I think cities really want to maintain control like they have under the CPUC 7901, which gives the cities time, place, and manner control. They may not be pleased with the recent FCC order, which really was aimed at ensuring the U.S. is competitive with China and other cities in rolling out 5G in the future. So, wireless carriers have a demand. Just like if you have a congested road, do you want to wait like 20 years to fix it? I mean, there's issues that carriers like AT&T proactively addressed by trying to put critical capacity in an exact location before it's really needed, before you as a user can't engage on your iPhone, for example. So I think, cities want to maintain local control, and they do with that, and that's what we're hearing about. And we're working collaboratively with many cities, and we've done agreements with many cities in the Bay Area.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Before I have a question, I just want to make one sort of comment. I guess I've relinquished the chair role, but I haven't relinquished the attitude totally yet, which is that, I just want to remind everybody, certainly my understanding is we have in place a considerably robust permitting process that we spent a lot of time on, and I'm not sure we're here to relitigate that at all. So that leads to the only question I have, which is sort of a big one, though, which is, I guess, another predicate. We had that the Verizon master license. I looked at that in great detail. We went through it. That's gone up to the council and been approved. What are the material changes, if any, between this form of master license and that one? Is that something that can be summarized easily?
There haven't been any significant changes to term. Most of it has just been language clarification that the lawyers for AT&T and our lawyers were comfortable with. But there hasn't been any substantial changes to it. It's mainly just been wording clarifications, and that's been about it. But substantially, it's the same maintenance agreement.
Because I skimmed this, I'll admit, but I didn't go line by line and do a
Yeah,
compare.
I mean, you wouldn't find that many changes in it. I think there was some changes to the required insurance because previously, I think we had the ability for self-insured, and AT&T doesn't need that, so there were some modifications to that. And offhand, I can't think of any. It was minor, almost grammatics and wording that one lawyer to another lawyer thought would be better. So.
Okay, so city attorney's office was heavily involved.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Okay. That ends my question. Thank you.
Cliff? Yeah, I just have just a question here. You mentioned initially your AT&T, as most companies, are going to start with 4G. Explain to me the transition from a 4G to a 5G, particularly as it relates to hardware. How would that work?
Yeah, with 5G, there's new spectrum that carriers are going to be deploying that are much higher frequencies than today's existing cellular network. The reason these higher frequencies are needed is because the amount of channel bandwidth to get 1 gigabit per second to your phone. So when it comes to that, there's going to be potential changes to antennas and radios associated with that.
Right. So because this is a question I get a lot of, and I think it's very poignant in terms of this discussion. Just trying to understand that transition, because 5G, which I understand has a radius of 250 to 500, somewhere in there, is going to be coming, is really the spectrum of choice. But explain to me what the box, how would that work? Would I take down my 4G hardware and then put up my 5G hardware? Do they have to cohabitate a pole for a period of time?
That's a great question.
Yeah. So explain that. I just would like to understand.
I think in terms of the physical assets, you'll see two different flavors of what I'll call a dual mode site that has 4G and 5G, where you could add 5G to an existing 4G pole.
Right. So they're different pieces of hardware. Yeah.
Yes. And so, the industry's under a high state of evolution in that regard right now, but you could take those form factors that I showed you with a cylindrical antenna on top, some radios attached, and attach a collar that has a 4G antenna or 5G antenna and 5G radio in it. That's one option. The other option is to deploy 5G only on certain poles, and I think you're going to see a mix of that.
Right. I would imagine any combination thereof. Because once again, our design specifications, I think it's 9 cubic feet. Yeah, it's 9 cubic feet. So, and that's why I ask. And that's everything, antennas.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you that that photo simulation, I can tell you that the combined visible equipment on there is roughly 3.5 cubic feet total.
Mm-hmm.
You know, against your 9 cubic feet. Now, the FCC established a maximum of 28 cubic feet for the equipment and 9 cubic feet for antennas,
Right.
which is huge. But, you know, there's no way it's going to go that direction, right? So
Right.
I think, you know, this is Cliff's opinion right now. I know that you could accommodate 4G and 5G on a pole and stay within that limit under the current plan and technology that's out there. But I think what AT&T would like to do is, you know, if we get the license agreement approved, we'll file for permit and we'll put some 4G poles up and we'll start building those this year.
Right. And then when 5G becomes commercially, which it will, 18.
It will.
Yeah, right.
It's going on in different parts of the country. It's going to come to the Bay Area pretty quick.
Right, yeah, yep, no, I know that. One last question, Tracy, and this goes back to the aesthetics issue. That is, this hardware would then be, the paint of the color of the hardware would be very similar to the color of the pole. And each pole I know changes a little bit, but,
Yeah, it would be painted to match.
right, okay, thank you.
Just a couple questions. One, I think, is for Tracy. So given that this is the second master license agreement, I'm wondering what would the process be for issuing permits if AT&T and Verizon both wanted to use the same street pole?
So we've been fortunate that it hasn't come up. So we have a selection where they can save a spot when they come in for a telecom permit. As soon as they give us the fee or deposit for our review, that holds the spot, and that's how we deal with it. So it's a first come, first serve. So if Verizon comes in and meets with us and gives us the deposit to hold the site, that prevents any other vendor from coming in and using that site unless at some point they cancel or decide not to pursue it. Then they get refunded their deposit and another vendor could come in. However, it's educational for other vendors on why did that site get canceled in the first place. So a lot of it could have been feedback from the public, or it's adjacent to a 3-story structure, and so it may prevent further ones from even coming through because they saw what happened with the first application.
Okay. And then, are there any barriers to protect against a telecommunication company putting a lot of street poles on hold and then canceling their fee?
Currently, we have nothing that would prevent that, but just from speaking with the telecoms that we have so far, it's a lot of money for them to come up with these design drawings, and putting down deposits just to hold the spots is not likely going to occur because thousands of dollars go into just planning the sites, not to mention the installation costs. So we're not seeing a large number come in and holding spots. Plus, they are required to do neighborhood meetings and other items that take time and would prevent them from actually pursuing sites that they really need.
Okay.
Yeah, I think there's also, if I may, through the chair, there's also a fee that they have to pay us up front, a deposit, and then also they have a time limit on their applications as well. So,
And if I may, what is the amount of the fee that they have to pay up front?
So it's according to our fee schedule. Currently for minor permits, which are the majority of the ones that come in that are approved by the director, it's around $6,000. And that's a deposit. So it's just to cover staff time, all of staff time for review of that particular site. If we use more, then we ask them for more. If we use less, then we refund the money back to them.
Okay. So there wouldn't be a case where both AT&T and Verizon, for example, would have a small cell on the same pole?
So currently, and Cliff might be able to speak to it, the technology is not great for sharing the exact same. They have to have a certain distance right now for each vendor for their antennas. So they're not able to co-locate, or if they do, they have to put something on it that separates them. Our current design standards don't allow for that. They have to be located vertically on the pole. So we're not seeing that happen as of yet.
Okay. And if advancements in technology were able to help have that co-location happen, how does that affect the radio frequency if there's two small cells on one pole?
So that would be part of the RF study. Fortunately, when we went to council, we got our ordinance approved by council, and that's set. But at Public Works discretion, the director can make changes to our engineering and design studies, and we're constantly updating it. In fact, we're due for an update. We've had it almost a year now, so we're hoping to come later this year with an update to it based on what we found in the last year, different technologies. We've learned a lot about smart meters, when they can and can't be used, and so we're continuously updating it. And also, if new technologies come, and we're starting to see that, even if we don't have it in our design guidelines, we mention the fact that they have to use the sleekest design, available at the time when they come in. And eventually, our design standards would catch up to that as well.
Okay.
Through the chair, as one more comment. Just so you know, we're not updating it behind closed doors before we actually update. We're working on the update, but when we update it, we'll bring it here for the Sustainability Infrastructure Commission to review prior to updating that document. That was one of the promises we made to the public.
Thanks, Brad. My last question is for Cliff. I'm wondering, given, I think this was brought up at the last meeting, that there was a resident who was notified of the permit being submitted many months after. And so I'm wondering if your team at AT&T has a specified staff that deals with resident complaints, and what is the timeline for notification of a permit submittal and a neighborhood meeting?
I think I'm not familiar with that example that you gave, but I think your ordinance too on the utility poles requires public outreach on those with adequate notification, but it sounds like there's an issue that I'm not familiar with.
Yes, so the ordinance provides for, there's notification. They have to do, if it's in a residential area, they're required to do a neighborhood meeting. Notice is sent out approximately 2 weeks before the meeting is set, and it's set out to 500-foot radius. And then also we put notification on our small cell webpage, and then our interested list. So if anybody signs up and wants to be updated on small cells, they can sign up for that and are notified. After the meeting notes are provided, comments, people can come. A lot of times people aren't able to come, but they'll provide us comments after, and those all get incorporated. And then at that point, the telecom decides whether or not this is a viable location for the reasons stated. If the reasons stated are, not something that's within our control, like we can't deny an application based on the RF emission and if it's close to a home, for example. There's certain legal requirements. They just have to meet the FCC, and our hands are tied on that. After that, it goes to Brad after lots of input from staff, and he makes a decision, and then we mail out a decision notice shortly after that. And we allow for a 2-week appeal period after that notification sent out. If they want to appeal, they come before you, the commission, to hear their appeal. We've had one so far where there was an issue. They felt it wasn't addressing their comments, and so they came to appeal it.
Okay.
It's quite robust, lots of opportunity for public input, and was the basis for really developing this ordinance, is because people felt they weren't getting heard before.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. Greg, you had a follow-up?
Yeah, Trish, do we have something in the wording in the agreement that one company can't sublease or, find a hot spot for the other companies and then sell it off to them? Do we have any wording in there regarding that versus somebody saying, hold it, I found the perfect spot for them and our coverage isn't as good, and I'll sell it off to you?
So currently we allow that, actually. There's companies out there, Mobility is one of them, where they build these and then they lease them out to Sprint or Verizon or AT&T. I don't know about AT&T, but they do lease them out. There's not, I mean, that's kind of the direction that we went because we do have companies that are just coming in to build them. They still follow the same rules that apply for getting the installations approved. But
The
it may
first
not-
come, first served thing?
Yep, same.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Tracy, a couple technical questions. Are these battery powered or are they drawing on the power off the pole?
They are powered from our streetlight grid, but they are metered separately.
They're metered separately, that's right, okay. And I don't recall seeing it from my scan of the agreement, but thinking long-term, eventually these will be obsoleted, right? There's already discussions about 6G, although it appears to be quite a ways away. So are there terms about removal once that occurs?
Yes, so there's terminology in our agreement, but in our telecom ordinance. So the telecom permit is good for 10 years. They can renew that once a year for 15 years. If at one point they decide not to renew it, they would need to remove their equipment.
Okay, great.
And one thing I just want to add, if say like they install their stuff and they're coming in, they installed 4G and 5G comes in, they have to still go through a telecom ordinance. It's called a 6409 application, and that's when they're making a minor modification to an existing site.
Mm-hmm.
So it still goes through a process.
Okay, great. So with that, why don't we open it up to public comment?
I have no public comment.
No public comment, okay. Then why don't we move to a motion if there is one?
I make a motion that we accept it and push it up to City Council.
Do I have a second?
I second the motion.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Okay. We're going to breeze along here, I think, in this meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cliff.
Moving on to item number 5, Green Infrastructure Plan Review and Approval. Are we making things too easy?
Good evening. My name is Sarah Scheit. I'm the Regulatory Compliance Manager with the City of San Mateo. A lot of this presentation, well, some of the slides you will remember from last month when Matt Fabry and I were here, that we presented an overview and sort of a background and where we were going with the green infrastructure plans. So today we actually have the draft green infrastructure plan, which is required under the Municipal Regional Stormwater Permit, Provision C3. It's required to treat PCBs and mercury via stormwater treatment through LID measures, green streets, and regional projects such as storm drain infrastructure on public and private lands, including streets, roads, storm drains, parking lots, building roofs, and other elements. The GI work plan was approved by City Council on June 5th, 2017. And as I mentioned, we brought an overview for you last month on June 12th. Today we'll review the plan in its entirety and provide a summary of next steps. So the purpose and goals of the plan is to demonstrate the city's commitment to gradually transform its traditional gray stormwater infrastructure to include green stormwater infrastructure. The goals are to align the city's policies and implementation strategies for green infrastructure with the general plan and other related planning documents. We also will identify and prioritize green infrastructure opportunities throughout the city. We'll establish targets for the extent of city area to be addressed by green infrastructure over certain timeframes. And we provide a work plan and legal and funding mechanisms to implement the prioritized projects. And lastly, the plan will establish a process for tracking, mapping, and reporting completed projects. So just as a reminder, you saw this slide in the last presentation. The Green Infrastructure Plan does give a definition of green infrastructure and goes over different types of green infrastructure concepts. Basically, we're using vegetation, soils, and other elements and practices to capture and treat and infiltrate urban runoff, thereby restore some of the natural processes so that we can manage water and create healthier urban environments. Green infrastructure facilities can also be designed to capture stormwater for uses such as irrigation and toilet flushing. The plan gives different types of examples for green infrastructure. Some of the examples that we've already installed are these biotreatment stormwater planters that were installed at Laurel Elementary School as part of the Safe Routes to School, and also along the Poplar Corridor. This is just a map from the Green Infrastructure Plan demonstrating all of the existing locations where green infrastructure is currently installed via, some of them are low impact development already installed on private development, and some of these are green streets projects that the city has already installed. This is just a quick slide. I'm not going to go through it, but it details the Green Infrastructure Plan elements as they're specifically required in the permit, and it tells you where you can find the description of these elements within the Green Infrastructure Plan. You'll see this in the administrative report where we talk about the required plan elements. So as part of the requirements is coordination with other documents and plans throughout the city. So we're talking about the general plan, the downtown plan, the climate action plan, bicycle plan, and the sustainable streets plan. All of these plans were reviewed to see if they have existing language that either support or prohibit green infrastructure. And all of them were found to have language that does support green infrastructure. So we also created a work plan for future integration of green infrastructure language when we update these plans. So also part of the Green Infrastructure Plan will be to collaborate and incorporate other regional plans, such as the San Mateo County Stormwater Resources Plan, which provides the building blocks for green infrastructure prioritization in regional projects. I'll talk more about these later as well. Also, the Sustainable Streets Master Plan, which CCAG is developing on a county-wide basis. That plan will also further prioritize and also build on climate change planning efforts, adding resilience to disadvantaged communities. It will also provide us with the required tracking and reporting tools. The Bay Area Integrated Water Management Plan identifies projects in the Stormwater Resources Plan which might be available for grant funding. Green Infrastructure Plan provides guidelines, details, and specifications. Most of these come from and reference the San Mateo County-wide Water Pollution Prevention Plan, which is SMCWIP, which is the acronym up there. Provided a design guide, so that would be, that guide also provides guidance on operations and maintenance and gives us templates for if we wanted to incorporate green infrastructure maintenance plans for private development to implement. The BASMA sizing guidance provides guidance for unregulated projects, so those that are not traditional or under 10,000 square feet of impervious surface. We also developed new details and utility protection guidance as part of our Green Infrastructure Plan and identified updates to city standards and details. This is just an example. This is one of the details that was created. This is a connected tree well with parallel parking. Other new details were developed and are included, and others are still being developed and renewed or reviewed. So Chapter 4 presents the methodology and results for identifying and prioritizing areas for potential green infrastructure projects and for estimating targets for the amount of impervious surface to be treated as part of public and private projects, according to certain timelines. Chapter 5 in the Green Infrastructure Plan outlines the strategy for implementing these projects within the next 10 years and through 2040. Again, the Stormwater Resource Plan from the county created the building blocks for green infrastructure prioritization and regional projects. These plans, along with the reasonable assurance analysis, which I'm going to define in a minute, CCAG created this, further informs the city's green infrastructure implementation goals and prioritization. The countywide Sustainable Streets Master Plan summarizes the prioritization, provides mapping and GIS details, and also tracking and reporting. These maps will be available to the public when the product is complete in late 2020. So the reasonable assurance analysis is sort of demonstrated through this graphic here. The reasonable assurance analysis, I'm just going to call it RAA, is required to demonstrate assurance that the load reduction goals can be met. The reasonable assurance capacity represents the total amount of green infrastructure facilities needed for stormwater capture and treatment to meet the pollutant reduction goals in each sub-watershed identified in this graphic. The total capacity can be met through a combination of treatment measures on private development, as well as regional projects, low-impact development, and green streets. The darker shaded sub-watershed areas are higher priority areas for green infrastructure since they need the most capacity. So the city is also evaluating some possible locations for regional projects, which are the most cost-effective type of green infrastructure facility. This map shows an overlay of potential regional project opportunities, high, medium, low, and correlates it with the reasonable assurance capacity that would be needed or that we could achieve with those specific projects. Green street opportunities were also identified as part of the plans. Again, green streets are more expensive per amount of impervious area treated, but there might be opportunities to collaborate with private development or integrate them into other city projects that make them more cost-effective. The same goes with low-impact development projects. So these would be on-site city projects. And there also might be opportunity to collaborate, with Caltrans or other city projects to make these also more cost-effective. So the reasonable assurance capacity presented in the plan represents just one cost-optimized solution to meet pollutant reduction requirements, but we can ultimately meet the requirement through any combination of projects. The RAA capacities are meant to serve as goals for the green infrastructure planning, but the project locations and combinations of green infrastructure types can ultimately be different. This graphic outlines the city's strategy for prioritizing, identifies the highest ranking sites, considering feasibility and potential performance, while the reasonable assurance analysis determines volume capture needs by sub-watershed. The strategy can be refined as funding and grant opportunities are assessed and ongoing coordination with various city departments occurs. So the Green Infrastructure Plan outlines with each project a high, low, and mid opportunities based on the reasonable assurance analysis and other prioritization strategies. The city's strategy for meeting the pollutant reduction goals can be subject to adaptive management. So this graphic basically says that we're choosing to meet our green infrastructure goals through future new and redevelopment, existing projects, and also through green streets. The Green Infrastructure Plan requires us to evaluate funding mechanisms excuse me. It requires us to provide an evaluation of prioritized project funding options, including alternative compliance funds, grants, transportation project grants from federal, state, and local agencies, existing permittee resources, or new tax or other levies and other sources of funds. This graphic here is just a representation of where our current funding for all stormwater activities comes from. And we're also in the process of performing an additional funding analysis, which will analyze these different funding options for all types of stormwater activities, including green infrastructure, operations and maintenance of our storm drain system, dredging, and capital improvements. CCAG also is providing us with a tracking tool through the Sustainable Streets Master Plan. This is what will eventually become available to the public, parts of it. The city will have a unique logon which we'll use to track our specific projects. It'll provide dynamic interactive maps. We'll have a dashboard. Each project page will have details for the different types of treatment systems. It'll estimate the percent load reduction from each system and allow us to create summaries of implementation for the green infrastructure for reporting back to the Regional Water Quality Control Board. So the city's outreach strategy for green infrastructure is to increase awareness, leverage resources and partnerships with other agencies and stakeholders. We'll communicate to specific target audiences as projects move forward, including residents, and it is an ongoing development and implementation. So the next steps is to get your input on the green infrastructure plan as presented. We would like to take it to City Council in August or September, depending on your input here. And the recommendation is that the Commission recommend that Council approve it through a resolution next month. We need to submit a green infrastructure plan to the Water Board by September 30th, 2019. And then will be ongoing implementation and the further funding analysis. So that's my presentation.
Great, thank you very much. So with that, why don't we open it up to questions? Jackie?
Thank you. I have a couple questions. Are the regional projects, so in the slide of the reasonable assurance analysis, there was a green spot that was in South San Mateo. Could you pull that slide up again? Never mind, that's outside of the city boundary. I'm wondering if...
This one?
No, I was looking at the past one, but it was outside of the city boundary, so never mind, disregard. If you go to the next slide where it shows how we'll meet the stormwater requirements, it's kind of a linear graph. This one. Mm-hmm. Is there a reason why regional projects aren't on here?
And if I may jump in on this, actually, this graph is not self-explanatory. There's an axis on the right and on the left, and it's not clear what's actually referencing what. Can you explain this graph, please?
I could try. It's a result of the reasonable assurance analysis where so the percent reduction that we need to specifically achieve is a 17.6% reduction in pollutants. The analysis of the different methods that we can do that through other projects, green streets, regional projects, and future and redevelopment were analyzed, and a cost estimate was provided, which is the right-hand axis.
But what's referring to the right side is, I guess, just a cumulative color bars saying how much they would cost, and this is a percent of total implementation cost. So I don't know what this means.
It is very confusing. Basically, if you look at the vertical red line, right, that sort of is the slice of the pie. If you, the x-axis is successive reductions in incremental sediment load reduction. So if we were to increase or decrease the loading of sediment to the bay, which the overall project has correlated to a reduction of PCBs and mercury loading to the bay. Our goal in reducing sediment is 17.6%, right? So that's sort of the where we stand on the x-axis. Vertically from within that, the opportunities that we have to meet that are for the future and redevelopment would be the orange bar, okay? And that would represent effectively both the 20 some odd acre feet capacity of water that we would need to treat, American units, acre feet.
Okay, so that's the left.
That would be the y-axis on the left, correct.
Right.
And then if you go up, you know, to the high and medium priority, those are the opportunities that we have, right? So
I see. So the big color bars are a reference to the left side. The black line is a reference to the right vertical axis.
correct.
Okay. So I would just ask in the future when there's a complex graph, because I don't think anybody in the public that looks at this, including me at least,
I think
would
we had to stare at
understand
it for a few hours
how
ourselves.
this is, what's referring to what axis and so forth.
Exactly, and so I apologize for the confusion. I think the takeaway here is that when you look at the regional project, to Commissioner Nunez's question of the dark blue up on the, I think the sort of the top right, is when the model is done, if we are able to achieve that vertical red line in terms of distributing private future new and redevelopment and the medium and high priority green streets, sort of that quantity, we will hit our objective. So, you know, we can do that any one of a number of ways, but this way would probably be the most cost effective. If we identify a regional project, for example, that might reduce the amount of, I can't tell what color that is, yellow, that we have to implement ourselves, or if we, you know, through requiring additional, if we impose additional requirements on private and new and redevelopment to treat public right-of-way, then that would consume some of the yellow. That would be a private implementation of treatment of the private right-of-way. So this is really just an example of, like, you can slice this a number of different ways, and that is sort of the most vertical section that you could, the most cost-effective vertical section that you would achieve.
Right. So in actual practical implementation, you might see little slices of a bunch of different colors
Exactly.
that would total up to the amount that we need.
Exactly, and this is really, I think, more to inform us as, you know, staff and as we look forward as to how we want to implement this, where are our opportunities. And I think that what we've concluded is there is a lot of opportunity in just pent up, you know, sort of the new and redevelopment, but also on the green streets themselves. When we have a development that is going to be, you know, working on our frontage, requiring that development also treat the right-of-way runoff. And then that eats into that yellow part, which would otherwise be a city-funded burden, right? And I think that's one of the takeaways here is that there is a lot of opportunity for new and redevelopment, and there's a lot of opportunity for that new and redevelopment to offset some of our burden that would be required to construct the green streets.
Okay, great. I apologize for that.
Thank you.
Sorry
Appreciate
for the confusion on the graph.
Thank you. My next question is related to CEQA approval. So if a specific green infrastructure project goes through and it's submitted a permit, what is the CEQA process to approve it?
The
if
project
any?
itself would need to go through the CEQA approval process.
Okay, and so the two projects that were at the end of the plan, those are being submitted with this plan, or those are projects that have already been permitted?
No, those are very highly conceptual projects that we would definitely need to go through CEQA to get approved if we chose to do them. They're just to demonstrate the type of what a regional project could look in the city of San Mateo. They're not in the capital improvement plan, and they would need to be further designed and researched and funded, and also go through the CEQA process.
Okay.
And through the chair, just to add to that, they are intended to be conceptual. They're not intended to highlight like our initial intent of projects that we're going to be evaluating out of the gate. But they do highlight some of the things that we think are important to consider going forward, such as runoff from freeways. Caltrans has some major stormwater concerns and that they're trying to fund and improve. So to the extent that we can identify areas where there is freeway runoff that we can add in and treat, or the regional projects where we can get other participation, because we're treating such a much larger watershed that maybe even be above and beyond what we need to treat as a city, other sources of funding might become available as well. So those are really concept projects to sort of illustrate a point. And if they vet out over the course of time as this program goes forward, which will be a dynamic plan, it won't be static once it gets adopted. That graph will be piece by piece, chunk by chunk, block by block as we go forward, right? And we'll have a tracking tool to that effect. But I think they hopefully illustrate a concept of what a regional project might look like.
Okay. Maybe some clarification around that those are just concepts. I don't know, maybe if that's stated somewhere in the report, but that would be helpful. And also, next question is related to, I know that there is a lot of analysis that goes into making sure that green infrastructure projects are feasible. What if after the fact, after it's approved and it's monitored, and it shows that the water is not hydrologically moving to that area, what happens then? And has that happened in the past?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
So
I'm not quite understanding.
So for example, the slope is not calculated well, and the water is not actually moving into the catchment area, what happens then?
Okay, so after it's built, if it's not functioning properly, we would inspect it post-construction for operations and maintenance, and if we would require it to be redesigned and re-engineered and fixed.
Okay. Last thing is the link on page 199, Appendix E, page 2 is inactive.
Oh, okay.
And that is,
Thank you.
I think that's to SMCWIP's Green Streets website. So I don't think it's with the city, but just for reference.
Appendix E?
E, page 2.
Now you know that somebody's actually reading the plan in its entirety.
Thank you for that, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Susan?
Sheila, can we go back to the graph we have just talked about? I just have a few questions on that. That's the graph that has costs, capacity, and targets. Thank you. Okay. How do we measure that the city has that target? Is that an annual target?
The target is the end target for 2040.
And what does that mean?
It means that we will have reduced the pollutant loading to meet the water quality requirements by that date.
Right.
By
And pollutant
installing green
loading
infrastructure.
is primarily PCBs and mercury. So that is, and does the city have a baseline from which to measure that this has been done? How would you measure it's been? So it's 17.6% reduction in pollutant loading from the city, primarily into the bay.
Right.
By 2040. Okay. How do we measure that?
We would measure that based on the work that they did as part of the modeling in the reasonable assurance analysis and the tools that CCAG is creating for us as part of the green infrastructure prioritization, monitoring, and tracking tool. So they'll be able to take a project and evaluate its specific watershed and compare it to that baseline that was established during the reasonable assurance analysis and give each project a sort of a load reduction.
Got
we'll
it.
be
So
able to
it's
track
really
over
an
time.
algorithm, a modeling
Yes.
type of, okay, all righty. And how about costs? Cost is 10.9%. What does that mean? Is that
I'm going to let Matt
is
answer
that the cost to implement whatever combination of green infrastructure projects, regional LIDs, green streets? That was a little bit of a mystery.
Yeah, I think this has many mysteries as a slide. So the cost.
There's a lot on this.
There is.
Yeah, yeah.
High density slide. The analysis was done countywide, right? It was done looking at the entire county. And again, the reasonable assurance analysis is a requirement that says that if we do these measures, we are reasonably assured that we will actually achieve our target reductions. And it's a GIS-based, parcel by parcel, looking at slope, impervious surface, I mean, a number of different variables. The cost, based upon their cost assumptions, would be San Mateo's share, if you will, of countywide compliance. So we have, ironically, we have a target of a 17.6 reduction in pollutant loading, roughly costed out at 10.9% of the total cost of what they identified in the reasonable assurance analysis. This is, again, using, broad strokes, numbers, unit cost, number of miles, number of feet, square feet, volume, that kind of thing.
Right.
But it's trying to represent a proportional share effectively.
Right. So our share would be whatever that county-wide dollar figure is. Ours is basically 11%.
Right, and as one of the larger cities, in the county.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the largest and most very dense, particularly in terms of cars. Okay, and so that is money, that 11% then is money the city would have to come up with to fund the projects.
Not
However-
necessarily. In fact, ideally, we would expand the orange bar to cover all of it. In one world. In an ideal world, this could be all funded out of private if we had enough development that happened in the city of San Mateo where enough frontage was redeveloped and we were able to treat the public right-of-way runoff. None of it might need, again, in the hypothetical extreme, right? None of it might have to be. So we're going to be going forward with these as opportunistic developments, looking at ways that we can require on-site additional treatment above and beyond what's already required, or again, anybody that touches a frontage and wants to redevelop a new parcel or whatever, requirements that they treat a certain proportion of the frontage as well. So that cost will be paid. The question is going forward, how will it be distributed? And we do have, as you know, we have the Sustain Smooth Streets program, and some of those we might install GI infrastructure because we're in the vicinity paving anyway. Ideally, we're capturing those costs at that point in time. But the private development group is also paying very close attention to, as developments come in, looking at ways that we can make sure we're maximizing on-site LID and green, that would count as green infrastructure, as well as, again, every square foot of frontage. I think right now we're developing a 75% threshold of frontage that needs to be treated for a new project that comes in. And the idea is that as development happens over time, that should add up between now and the compliance deadline.
Right.
It's not an exact science. I couldn't tell you exactly how many miles of frontage versus on-site versus regional versus whatever we're going to be at in 2020. The goal is that we're at that thought.
Right, okay. And that helps. So can somebody, and it was clear to me as I looked at this, that the future new and redevelopment projects, if I was to, it's got, it could potentially carry the cost load. That was very clear to me looking at this, looking at the schematic. So really, the city would need a combination, what looks to be, to hit that 17.6%. In the yellow, that's Green Street's medium priority, Green Street's high priority, future and new developments and existing projects. And as you said, any combination thereof. What are some of our existing projects? What would be examples of existing projects?
I think we have a list on.
It's in chapter 5. We have an existing list, but some of the existing projects would be like along Delaware.
Right.
The San Mateo, the Poplar Corridor.
Right, okay, yes, and I do remember looking at that. Okay, so now I know, I understand that. And new and future new and redevelopment might be Passage, for
Yes.
example. Okay. Just a few more questions. Sheila, could you go back to the maps with the RAA capacity, and just start with the regional.
Okay.
Yeah, let's see. Is this the one? Is there another map? Anyway, the regional are, I understood, the most cost-effective and the largest. But these are not, there's another map with that Commissioner Nunez had just looked at. He had just pulled that up. Can you pull that back up? I just want to make sure I'm interpreting this correctly. Thank you, yeah. Okay, so this is the RA. And that the green is outside our city boundary. It looks like it's somewhere in Belmont.
It's either in Belmont or Redwood City, the Redwood Morton
Sure, yeah.
project.
So going back to a question is, ideally, the darker the color, the more water that is captured. And more water that's captured, it helps us to meet our goals.
The darker shaded areas are higher priority areas since they need the most capacity. Those areas have been identified as
There's
higher
a lot of
priority.
runoff. There's a lot of runoff, so sediment can be captured.
Yeah,
and help us.
They might be better for drainage in those areas, or they might have actually more PCBs identified in those areas.
Right. Okay. So.
Yeah, one way of thinking about this map is that we need to capture more volume in acre feet
Right.
in the dark blue over the course of any given time period than an area shaded white. And that is, again, because the RAA is looking at sediment load reduction as a surrogate for PCB and mercury reduction.
Right.
And so when you look at flow, when you look at the hydrology and all that, the RAA then sort of categorizes that. And you overlay that with the projects and, it's a crystal ball that we,
Sure,
look into.
but really, the dark blue has got a lot of flow, and because there's a lot of flow, there could be more sediment going to the bay, and therefore we, the city, would want to capture and focus in those
Correct.
areas. Okay. Sheila, can we go to the next slide? Let's see. This is regional. I think we have regional LIDs and then green
Green
streets.
streets.
Can we go to the green streets? Yeah. So if I was to look at this, I see the dark blue with the RAA, but yet I have streets in yellow, but I've got them I've also got streets in red, which looks to be Lorry Meadows, I think. But yet a lower RAA. What would happen here? Would you go after the red streets, the high priority green streets?
So this is a good question. When we talk about high priority in this context, it's more a high opportunity, if you will. So there's a greater opportunity in that area to install a green street,
Right.
say, for example, due to a number of different conditions. It's not necessarily saying that, and this is based on all the different ranking criteria that we go through, right? So it has the highest priority of meeting our objectives for green streets, and it is, but it's part of that is it feasible to build there too? And you would have to weigh it. Some of it's going to be, do we have a project there versus at all? And if we had $1 million to spend in 2 different locations, we would probably want to spend it on a red street in the dark blue area, as opposed to on a red street in the lighter blue area, right? It's going to come down to the sort of the case-by-case levels, if you will. But this is really just serving to give us as staff and, the public as we go forward, a sense of where we need to focus our efforts. This is a sort of a good visual indicator of, I need a lot of volume out of the dark blue, but my highest scoring streets are over here. So visually, you can sort of sit down and go, okay, if I need to get into the details, I can, but this is a really good summary that gives me a feel of how all of these balance out. And same with the regional, same with the LID, right? Some of the LID would be on parcel, and an on parcel project that came up for development in a dark blue area, we would be very interested in seeing a lot of extensive LID built on those parcels.
Okay, all right. Very good, thanks.
Cliff?
Yeah, thanks. If I may, since I don't see any yellow slips, if I could do comment rather than questions, and I'll pass if we come back around. Because I don't have a lot of questions. Sarah, I want to say thank you. This is an awesome plan. It is a plan. And I guess my comment is really directed to, the fact that, we're shooting 21 years out. And, I'm old enough to remember it wasn't too many years ago, and we didn't have a lot of development. And we had diddly in terms of in lieu and other fees, and we just struggled along. But things are cyclical. So right now things are going, and I think it'll be very interesting to see what comes out of our CIP and what comes out of private development. But it's a great plan to give guidance for that, and it'll be fun to see where we are in, say, 4 or 5 years as we go down this. So thanks.
And just to add on to that, one thing this document does do, and I may have mentioned this before, is it gives us a good nexus between stormwater compliance and development that allows us then to impose conditions on developers that, in the absence of this document, we really have no nexus to tie an improvement that we require to a particular parcel or frontage. So this is going to be a useful document just for the purposes of creating a position for the city in the first place, if that makes sense.
Which actually raises an interesting question. Does planning get to review, the Planning Commission get to review this, or it'll just, when they review development, this will be something brought up at the time?
I believe it'll be development. We're not planning on submitting it to planning.
I wasn't suggesting, by the way. I just was curious. All right.
We do discuss this. All the PA applications and planning applications, this does get incorporated, so it would be reviewed at some point by them.
Okay. Very good. Thank you. Thanks, Sarah.
Greg?
Again, this is all logic. This is long-term, like you were just saying. It takes a lot of thought and forethought to put it all together. And versus if we didn't have it, we'd be trying to figure it out later. So good job. And again, it's just how you connect it all, and then where do you get the funds? And if the funds run out, oops, how do we keep figuring it? So it puts a burden on where people say we're overbuilt. We don't want to have more build, but then we need the funds for this stuff because we need the stuff to improve, to get the stuff that's going to the sewer treatment and sediment that's wrong. So we need it, and as we've seen it on Delaware, it looks good, it works good, it makes sense. As I say, it's a lot easier to clean up can bark in your backyard with a dog than to have to do all the other things. And here we're just going into an area, cleaning it up, the water's draining off it, and we don't have it going into our storm drains, which is what is our goal in the first place. So thank you, staff. Thank you for all your work.
Great, thank you. Very interesting, actually, and obviously a lot of complexity. And I'm actually quite excited about this because, as noted in the document, there are a number of co-benefits. It's not just the pollutant reduction, but it's also groundwater replenishment, it's flood control, and a variety of other benefits. One thing I want to confirm, as I understand it, this is really about, the core objective from the Water Board standpoint is control of PCBs and mercury, which are primarily point source generated. Is that accurate?
Those are, well, at one point you could say that they were point source generated, but now they're everywhere. So it has essentially become a non-point source issue.
Can you elaborate on the sources?
Sources of PCBs?
PCBs and mercury, yeah.
Mercury, I think, is mostly from atmospheric deposition or that would be point sources. Sometimes we found mercury in storm drains near a hospital just from illegal dumping and things like that. They can be found in fluorescent lights when people improperly dispose of their light bulbs and things like that. And legacy, it's just legacy pollutants from the mining, mostly in the South Bay. That's an issue, but it is, the requirement is to reduce the loads in the entire San Francisco Bay. So that sort of becomes our issue as well, and we have to do what we can. PCBs are in building materials. They're caulking, adhesives. It can rinse off from buildings through, when it rains or through the demolition process. We actually have an entirely different program as part of the permit to regulate demolition and control the PCBs in demolition. They're also found in old transformers, elevator, the lubricants. They're kind of everywhere.
Interesting. One thing I'm not entirely clear on is it appears that the plan is entirely focused on containment or filtration efforts in public right-of-way. Is that accurate?
That's just one element. We will also be focused on creating what's called low-impact development or stormwater treatment on-site. So that regulation's been in place since 2005, where a project comes in and it's greater than 10,000 square feet of impervious surface, they have to treat the stormwater on the site. What we haven't had them do in the past is treat the stormwater in the public right-of-way. That's historically been just a functionality of the city through installing green streets is different from LID on site.
Sure. But certainly this plan should inform possible strategies for where on-site might be even more important or what strategies might be appropriate, right? So there are some examples here of, parking lots with permeable pavers and that sort of thing, which of course is in many cases just general good sort of green practice. I'm curious if this is an opportunity to start some discussion about possible enhancements around permeable surfaces, which is something that's incredibly important from a groundwater replenishment and flood control standpoint in any case. And as we see increasing climate impacts, we are likely to see more extremes, more heavy drought years and then more extreme rain. And so these areas are going to become incredibly important over time.
Agreed. The document, our green infrastructure plan, actually references and incorporates a couple of other technical guidance documents. One of them is the Green Infrastructure Design Guide that the countywide program has put out. That will provide design guidance for permeable pavement and things like all types of green infrastructure structures. And also there's C3 technical guidance that has historically applied to regulated projects. So that provides like numeric sizing criteria for actually sizing the treatment devices to treat a certain amount of flow and pollutants and be effective.
So, and I guess maybe I'm not sure if this is a question, who this is a question for, but is there an opportunity here to look at those and consider where there might be code enhancements that the city might consider as part of the learning and then extension of these learnings into other areas to further improve our overall performance?
Yeah, I think that, the old permit required sort of the 10,000 square feet and more to implement LID. It also didn't really have any requirements for trash capture. So things that we've modified, and I think what this document is trying to sort of embody, if you will, going forward, is that threshold of 10,000 square feet really isn't relevant anymore when you develop a GI plan. It's sort of the old school way of thinking. It's the old C3. So, and what we're under right now, we call MRP 2.0, and 3.0 is underway, right? So MRP 2.0 is the next round, and it requires this GI plan. The GI plan sort of expands on and sort of, not necessarily gets rid of, but now we still have LID. In fact, I think one of the photos we had showed sort of the LID opportunities that we saw throughout the city. Some of those are areas that might be developed where we will require on-site additional, runoff treatment, whether it be permeable pavers, whether it be bioretention and parking lots, or whatever. So we're still dealing with a permit's got to come in the door. We evaluate it, and if it's a parking lot and they're changing more than 10,000 square feet, for sure. So I think that the design guidelines also help us in just saying this is what you must do. And if you're doing a parking lot, here's what a tree well looks like. So the process is going to be much smoother going forward, where we're not having to review someone else's design. They know the size it needs to be. They know what it needs to look like. It's based on our own standard details. You want to build them, update a parking lot, and you need to pull a permit. Here's what the design looks like, and here's what you have to build. So I think that this document and the details will make that process much smoother.
And I guess my question is are there, because it looks like, if I understand correctly, that those issues are going to be, most salient in those parts of the city that are the hot spots, right, under the plan. But are there opportunities to extend those through perhaps code integration into other parts of the city to get that groundwater capture and filtration benefits and so forth?
So on the groundwater front, there's not a huge, there are not a lot of recharge areas within the city of San Mateo, unfortunately. Just generally speaking, those surface groundwater interchanges are more up towards Daly City. And here we tend to have a lot of clay at the surface. It is one of the prioritization criteria that we have in this. Unfortunately, that one never ranks very high, right? Certainly the flood attenuation, the flow attenuation, reducing peak flows, all of that is definitely built into any improvement that you'll see in this program. I don't think we're trying to restrict implementation in any way, shape, or form at this point. So if we see opportunities to implement green infrastructure, and I think we highlighted last week the North San Mateo Drive project, where it's a sort of a lane diet, and we're adding GI all along that stretch as well. So when things change, when people are redeveloping, when we're touching a road, when someone's redoing and repaving a parking lot, all of those are opportunities to add GI. Sure. And I don't think we're trying to restrict anything, and if we can add on to it, I think we certainly will. There's a lot of work to do to get to 2040 or whatever it is, despite the fact that it seems like it's a long ways away.
Sure.
It'll sneak up on it. I'll be retired, but hopefully.
No, that's helpful. And coming back to the question of measurement, if I understood correctly, the entire process is evaluated on the basis of modeled system. Does the water board do measurements to actually track what the actual results are? And is there a way of tying those to what's, regionally or geographically where those pollutants are likely sourced?
The water board is going to be relying on us and the countywide program to develop the mechanisms and the modeling for tracking and reporting and quantifying. So we're heavily relying on the county for this and all the modeling. It's pretty complex that they did in the RAA, and I probably won't be able to answer the technical questions on that. But the water board doesn't have a mechanism. They're relying on us, and they come to all of the CCAG meetings and sort of weigh in where they can. But this is our plans. They may come back and review it and give us additional guidance, or. And
my question is actually not so much directed at who's doing the measurement, but modeling is only as good as it's calibrated to what's actually going on at some point. I'm just curious, at some point, somebody needs to take real measurements and not just assume that the modeling is actually representing the reality.
You would think. Ironically, the MS4 permits don't necessarily work that way. There's not a pre-concentration and a post-concentration, and you subtract out and do the flow, and I've reduced it by this much mass. That's why the reasonable assurance analysis was done, is that if I do these measurements, if I implement this, I'm reasonably assured that I will have achieved the objective, right? And if you notice, the model is actually looking at sediment reduction. Well, there's no real one-to-one demonstrated correlation of a grain of sand versus this PCB and versus that. So this is, as is typical for these types of permits, you are going about it in the best way you can. When Sarah was talking about point source versus non-point source, nowadays non-point source is basically any urban runoff is considered non-point source, even though it might be coming out of a pipe. Right? And so we're looking at it holistically. We're looking at it watershed wide, but It is rarely in these kind of non-point source situations based upon a series of data, like times Q, times, new data, and doing the arithmetic that way.
Okay.
We're doing a before and after model.
Yes, I understand. Okay. All right. That's peculiar, but I understand that that's the way it is.
I would add that there is a whole monitoring element to the permit. So there was actual on-the-ground monitoring for PCBs as part of the whole analysis that the program did. They continue to monitor our creeks and the bay as part of I think it's section C8 and of the regional monitoring program.
Okay, and that's just out of curiosity, that's run by who?
That's run by, well, we pay into the program and it's run by CCAG.
Okay, so there is measurement, it's just not directly tied to this plan. Okay. All right, great. Those are all my questions. Thank you. Please, Susan.
Yeah, this is a very specific question. In the plan, under the citywide pedestrian master plan, section 2.1.5, there was reference to a policy, 3.B.2. Do you know where one can find that policy?
Well, it's not actually a policy document. It's a policy as related to the vision and goals within the pedestrian master plan. So it's the policy itself is that sentence within that plan. And there are other policies within that plan that support the goals and the vision.
Okay, so that's within the pedestrian master plan.
Correct.
And that's a specific statement, and
Yes.
that's its reference. Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think we want to move to public comment.
I have no comment slips.
All right, then I think it's time to entertain a motion.
You'll entertain a motion. I'll make it to recommend that the City Council adopt a resolution approving this final green infrastructure plan.
Do we have a second?
I second the motion.
Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
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 Thank you for all your work on this. All right, and with that, we can go to reports and announcements.
Yeah, so one thing I needed to check on is with the Public Works Commission, the former Public Works Commission, I'm not sure what Sustainability Commission did, but we usually were dark in August, so I need your input on whether you want to have a meeting on August 14th or whether you're okay taking a break for the month. We do not have any items scheduled. If you have the crystal ball in front of you, we don't have any items scheduled for that meeting. We have some scheduled for the next meeting in September. So those items are the climate action plan update, small cell updates, and the design engineering standards for the small cells, and then the Bay Meadows traffic action plan update. So I'd look to the commission for your pleasure on the August meeting. And that's all I have.
Commissioner comments?
I'm okay going dark. That's first day of high school, and I'm sure I'll be fielding something that evening, so I'll be happy to not have a meeting unless there's something urgent that requires it.
I agree.
Fine with me, I'm indifferent.
So my only comment here is the timing for the items not yet scheduled. We do have several items listed in the crystal ball. And can you comment on that, Brad?
You turned off your mic.
Yeah, I think if I recall right, we will probably bring the sewer lateral discussion back in October. We won't be ready until that time period because there's still some work going on with that. And I think the same would be for the update on recycling and the SBWMA, SBR issue as well. I don't think that's an urgent item, so that could be even in November. So.
Okay, yeah, that seems reasonable to me, so I have no objection. Okay, and Susan, you had raised an item earlier with regards to upcoming agenda items.
Sure, yeah. As I had mentioned during the June meeting, there is going to be a very important cost-effectiveness study to be released in mid-August as it relates to the benefits or lack thereof of electrification for multifamily buildings greater than 4 stories, and it includes hotels. So I thought it would be important for the SIC to hear the results from that. As I've mentioned, it is by far the most common building construction in our city, particularly moving forward with some of the large developments. So I would like to propose, and once again, the studies will be coming out in mid-August, tentatively, that it be heard possibly during the September meeting, maybe the October meeting. And that is the results of that study.
Other commissioners, comments on this item?
I'd also be interested in hearing the results of it. I'm not sure when the timeline would be appropriate for that, but would definitely be interested.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd be happy to have that. I just want to make it clear that in the short run, what we're talking about is getting the results of the study. It would be put on the agenda so it's Brown Act compliant, it's public notice. We get the result, we can give our comments, but we're not asking for a staff response or action at this point, though that may be a result of it.
Staff comment on the proposed action here?
Yeah, I think we can add that to the schedule, so I don't see that being a problem if that's what the commission would like to do.
And I want to remind commissioners I'm recused on this item due to my role at PCE. Any other announcements? Greg?
Yeah, I would like to see us being able to work on Cal Water, bringing them in to talk with us, because we had years on sustainability discussing water, and then increases and everything else. And I'd like to talk about where are we going and what happened after, and did we have decreases, or are they planning anything? Because it always seems to go up, and everyone always says, then what happens after when, oh, we got a ton of water, but our bills are up. So I'd like to see what we can do to bring them in to talk about what is the plan or what happened about that. And then one last thing, for the public, you got Pride and Joy playing tomorrow night, the music in the park. And again, that's great, 6 to 8 o'clock, our beautiful park system. So when you come in to have music and celebrate the summer, you can't do it better than having a great band like Pride and Joy.
And buy your beer and wine from the Park Foundation booth. I'll be there.
Through the chair.
Money goes to the city.
So before we close on the proposed Cal Water item, is there concurrence from other commissioners that this merits agendizing?
I agree.
Yes, yep.
The one thing I would note here is, personally, I'm quite interested in Cal Water's update on their climate planning and how that relates. So when we last had Cal Water here 2 meetings ago, they referenced that they are developing a new climate assessment. Mm-hmm. And so one option, if you're amenable, Greg, would be to time those two things once that climate action plan is available, and then they would both speak to the rates issue and their update on their climate assessment. Are other commissioners amenable to that?
Sure, yep.
Yes.
That's
And
true.
did I hear that the request is specific to rates and consumption? and how that has been changing over time with Cal Water. I just want to make sure that they come in prepared to talk about the right topic, and they can focus on sort of the historical water use and where their rates are going and what they're going to be doing with it. 'Cause they talked about that a little bit last time, but I don't think they focused on like use and projections and whatnot. Okay. That's right.
And may I add, because I think Cal Water is a very pertinent topic, you know, the aspect of recycled water, smart meters, some of the, what I would consider 20th century tools, but let's see what they have to say in terms of recycled water, smart meters, conservation.
Any other announcements from commissioners or staff? Okay, hearing none, this meeting is adjourned.